Lekutei Sichos Chelek Chav Daled Devarim Beis Lili Nishmas Rabbi Yosef Binyamin Ben Menashe Kaltman. We have a classic Rashi Sikha today. We haven't had one of those in a while, and of course with some very beautiful lessons at the end. So the beginning of Parshas Devarim is Moshe Rabbeinu telling the Yidden, or retelling to the Yidden, some of their experiences that they went through together during the course of time in the Midbar. Noch der Akdome, betchilas Parshasenu wegen dem Matzev, Zmanu Mokim, wo Yidden und Moshe haben sich gefunden b'shas Amidus Mishnah Torah. So right in the first few psukim, he tells us where they are, what time it is, what era it is, when Moshe is saying Mishnah Torah, the Chumash Devarim. Haupt an die Torah überzugeben, was Moshe hat gesagt, die Yidden, the Torah begins to convey to us that which Moshe Rabbeinu told the Yidden. And he said, Hashem Elokeinu, Diber Eleinu b'chayrev Leimer. Hashem spoke to us at Chayrev, which is at Har Sinai, Leimer, saying, Rav lochem sheves b'har hazeh, which I will see in a moment what this means, but literally means you've been at this mountain long enough. In other words, it's at this point, which is about, as we'll see later, it's the date is Chaf Iyar. It's the 20th day of Iyar, in the second year after the Yidden left Mitzrayim, which means the Yidden left Mitzrayim and Tezvav Nisan, and 7 weeks later they received the Torah on Shavuos, and then a few months later on Yom Kippur, Moshe came down with the second Luchos. The next day, Moshe Rabbeinu begins to tell the Yidden about the building of the Mishkan. Rosh Chodesh Nisan, almost 6 months later, they dedicate the Mishkan, and then about a month and 20 days later, on Chaf Iyar, the Eibishter gives the commandment that they should leave Har Sinai, where they've been encamped for quite some time, almost a year, and to start traveling towards Eretz Yisrael. So the way Moshe says it, phrases it here in Parshas Devarim, that Hashem spoke to us at Chayrev, saying, you've been here long enough. Rashi quotes these three words, Rav lochem sheves, and is mefarish, and explains. Kipsutai, literally, it means you've been here for enough time. Rav lochem sheves, you've sat here enough. B'har hazeh, this mountain. V'yesh medrash agoda, and there is a medrash on this. Here bolochem gedula uschar al yeshivaschem b'har hazeh. Hashem multiplied, Hashem increased the amount of greatness and the amount of reward for sitting at this mountain. In other words, Rav doesn't mean enough. Rav means a lot, a quantity, that you've had a great amount of greatness and schar and reward for being here. For example, Asisa Mishkan Menorah v'Kelim, and during this time you built the Mishkan with the Menorah and the other Kelim, the other vessels of the Mishkan. Kibaltim Torah, you received the Torah. Minisim lechem Sanhedrin, you appointed for yourself Sanhedrin, Sarei Alafim v'Sarei Meis, officers over the 1,000, officer over the 100. So a lot of things happened during this time. You gained so much during this time. This is the second Pirush of Rashi. Darfim Verstehen. So the Rebbe is going to ask a series of questions. First, questions in Pshat of Rashi. Aleph. Rashi's job is to explain the literal understanding of the pasuk. So in that case, why does Rashi not suffice with the literal explanation, as Rav lochem meant dai lochem, that Rav lochem means it was enough for you? Why does Rashi have to bring a Medrash Agoda? The Mefarshim learn, as late in Ershton Pirush is schwer, that according to the first explanation, we're left with a question. For the Lefize had Gedar Stein Beferish Dai Lochem, Nit Rav Lochem. If Rav Lochem means it's enough, so the pasuk should have said Dai Lochem. And therefore Rashi says, according to these Mefarshim, that there's a Medrash Agoda. Aber Lecheda, that's not kosher. But seemingly this cannot be a real question. As a Taich Rav Dai. We find earlier in Parshas Va'era, where it says, Pari said to Moshe, Ha'atiru la Hashem, El Hashem, V'rav miyois koilos, Elikimu bara, there's been enough of these thunder and the hail. And Rashi says, Dai loy b'meshahayrid kvar, it's enough, hail already fell. So you see that the Taitus Rav Dai, und bringt nicht kein zweiten Pirush. And Rashi doesn't bring a second Pirush. So clearly the pasuk could say Rav, the Taich could be Dai, it's enough. and there's no need for Rashi to bring a second pirush. So therefore, we're back to our main question, our original question: why does Rashi not suffice with the kipshutoi, and instead Rashi brings a second pirush Medrash Haggadah? That's our first question. Beis, in the second pirush of Rav von Lashon Ribui here, Balachem, in the second pirush. The Rav means quantity, that Hashem gave you a lot, Ribui Gdula, a lot of greatness, was Eden of Bakum Baharaza, which Eden received at this mountain. Isn't it verstandig? We have two more questions on the second pirush. One, why is Rashi choosing to give examples of greatness that are brought in a medrash? Lishitosai pshute shel mikra hat gedarf bringen die gedula was hat sich aufgetan beharazeh welche is mefurish pshute shel mikra. Since Rashi it takes the approach of pshute shel mikra, then the examples that Rashi gives should have been examples that are written explicitly in pshute shel mikra. For example, the pasuk says, "Haniya kadavar hagadol hazeh." Has there ever been such a great thing? Or has anyone ever heard such a thing? That a nation should hear the voice of Hashem speaking through the fire. So the pasuk refers to this as a davar hagadol. So if the pasuk calls it a davar hagadol, then seemingly it should be a perfect example for Rashi for the gedula, for the greatness that the Yidden received at Matan Torah. So why does Rashi give examples from Medrash instead of giving examples from which the Torah itself, the pasuk itself, refers to in Parshas Va'eschanon as a davar gadol? Now you're going to say, well, it says kibaltem Torah. So Rabbi clarifies, Rashi der mont nor kabbalas ha-Torah, kibaltem Torah. Rashi mentions the receiving of the Torah, but he doesn't talk about how the Torah was given, that a nation was able to hear the voice of Hashem. Which the pasuk refers to it as something great. That the voice of Hashem is speaking through the fire. So if we want to give an example of Harbe Gedula, this should have been a perfect example, one that the pasuk calls a davar gadol, and yet Rashi doesn't give this as an example. Two, the second question, in the Inyanim was Rashi rechint, is nitef hasefil nikir di Gedula, was is nischadish geworden in zei baharazeh. Seemingly, what is Rashi saying? Rashi is saying, according to the second pirush, that you received a lot of greatness at Matan Torah. So at Har Sinai. So something, because you were at Har Sinai, you received certain great things of greatness. But seemingly, asks the Rebbe, these things that you're referring to weren't really something fresh and new, that they weren't introduced at Har Sinai. They weren't introduced at Har Sinai. It wasn't brand new. For example, kibaltem Torah mitzvahs is nit niyas chadosh. The fact that we received the Torah and mitzvahs is not brand new. Adam Rishon and Avram received instructions from Hashem, which is the idea of Torah milashon Torah. All of the Noachites, all of the people of the world were commanded with 7 commandments. Says given yeshiva Shem ve'ever, there was a yeshiva of Shem ve'ever where people learned Torah. And even if you're going to say, well, that was for the nations, what about Yidden? Und bei Yidden haben Torah mitzvahs angegeben von the others. Torah mitzvahs begins with the others. For example, the Maimer Chazal, Mimein Shalaveseinu, Leparshi Shizumeyam, from the days of our avos, yeshiva, learning in yeshiva never stopped. Or Kim Avram Avinu is called Torah Kula Achlei Nitna, that Avram, even the mitzvah of Tavshilin, that Avram Avinu fulfilled the entire Torah. So even as Yidden, the Torah has been passed down to us from our avos. Also the idea of judges also existed before Matan Torah. Even obviously by the other nations, because the only way to run a country without anarchy is when there's a judge, a leader. And certainly by the Yidden, they had shoftim, they had people that led, that instructed. So, Sai the Inyan of Kibaltem Torah and Sai the Inyan of Sanhedrin really didn't start with Har Sinai. It starts before Har Sinai. So how do you use that as an example of Gedula? True that it it got more. There was more mitzvahs. But to say that we received the Torah and that was the gedula that we got because we were at Har Sinai, seemingly that gedula started earlier than Har Sinai. So that's our second question. So far we're asking, why is the first pirush of Rashi not sufficient? Why do we need a second pirush? And in the second pirush, we're asking, number one, why does Rashi not mention the davar gadol of Hashama koila lakim, that the Yidden heard the voice of Hashem speaking through the fire? And we're also asking that some of these examples that Rashi brings seem to not be something new from the being at Har Chorev, being at Har Sinai. We have additional questions, additional nuances in the second pirush of Rashi. The order that Rashi mentions these things, first Mishkan, then Torah, then Sanhedrin, is not consistent with the chronological order of events. First was Kabbalah Satera. The Yidden received the Torah on Har Sinai on Zavav Sivan. Then later than that came the appointment of the Sanhedrin according to the Ha'ara. 13, we're understanding from the Psukim that the mini of the Sanhedrin took place on Machras Yom Kippurim, the day after Yom Kippur, which is a few months after Kabbalah Satera. And only about 6 months after that was the erection of the Mishkan. So why does Rashi mention these three events in a non-chronological order? Beis Rashi sagt Mishkan, Menorah, V'Kelim. Rashi says the Mishkan, the Menorah, and the rest of the vessels of the Mishkan. Uitgeteilt Menorah von Shar Klei HaMishkan. So he separates Menorah from all of the other Kelim. Unit Mishkan v'Kelim Stam. Rashi does not say the Mishkan and its vessels, but it's Keil Eich to Menorah, which the vessels would have included the Menorah. Why does Rashi have to say Umenorah? Could have said the Mishkan and the vessels, which would have included the Menorah. Why does Rashi specify the Menorah specifically? Gimel Rashi typed up Sanhedrin. Sorry, Alaf Sorry Meis. When Rashi mentions the Sanhedrin, Rashi explains that there were the Sarei Alafim, the officers over the thousands, and the officers over the hundreds. And Rashi omits the officers over the 50s and the officers over the 10s. So that's three questions. Number one, the order of Rashi, Mishkan, Torah, Sanhedrin. Number two, the specification of the Menorah, the specifying the Menorah, and two, the omitting of Sarei Chamishim and Sarei Asaris. The Kash is very noch starker, and these questions are intensified. B'shas ben zetas in Sifri versus Lechera the Makar for Rashi's Pirush. When we look in the Sifri, which seems to be the source of Rashi, Sheitaka Asiyas HaMishkan no Kabbalah Satayru Min Sanhedrin. With regards to making the Mishkan, the Sifri writes it at the end after receiving the Torah and the appointment of the Sanhedrin. Estet Mishkan v'Kelim, when it's nit uitgeteilt die Menorah, the Sifri writes Mishkan v'Kelim and does not specify the Menorah. Und es bringen sich euch Sarei Chamishim v'Sarei Asaris, and the Sifri does bring the officers over the 50s and the officers over the 10s. When Rashi is Mishana, Rashi changes. Und in drei Pratim, in dem zweiten Teil allein von seinem Pirush, vom Makar Pirush, and in the second part of his Pirush, in all three details, Rashi changes from the Sifri, which seemingly is his source. So not only are we asking why Rashi does it, we're also asking why does Rashi change from the Sifri in each of these three details. In Sif Gimel, we have three more questions on the first part of the second pshat in Rashi. We also have to understand that why Rashi changes in his first part of the second pirush in comparison to the Sifri, which again, at this point, we are under the impression that the Sifri is our source, Rashi's source. And again, we see three changes. Aleph, in Sifri steht blo yischaru lachem. The Sifri says it was a reward for you to be at the mountain. Rashi is meisef nachanin in gedula uschar. And Rashi adds another detail: greatness and reward. It's one difference. Beis in Sifri is their lashon tzchar ulachem yeshivaschem barazeh. In Sifri, the words mean your dwelling, your being at this mountain was a reward for you. The yeshiva gufa is their schar, implying that the very being there was in itself a reward. Rashi sagt aber hier bolachem gedulo uschar al yeshivaschem ba'arazeh. The Eibishter increased your greatness and your reward for sitting at this mountain, being at this mountain. The schar is at teitzof on yeshivaschem ba'arazeh, implying that the reward was an outcome, a result of being at the mountain, not that the being at the mountain was the reward. Gimel, and the third point, their lashon hasifri is minisi aleichem. I appointed for you the Sanhedrin. The Eibishter hat a mamana given, which means that Hashem chose appointed the Sanhedrin. Rashi sagt minisem lochem, as the Yidden have a mamana given. Rashi says that the Yidden appointed the Sanhedrin. So again, why is there a difference? Why is this Sifri saying one thing and Rashi saying something else? The bir b'chozeh. So here comes the bir. And really there's going to be one nekuda that's going to be the underlying, as very often happens with the Rashi Sikha, but we're not going to get to that nekuda until Sif Hey. So Sif Daled is like an intro to Sif Hey that ultimately will give us the one point that is going to carry us through the whole bir to understand this Rashi. But let's begin with Sif Daled. The bir b'chozeh. Rav lochem bepashtus meint as es is nit nor dai lochem, es is eich genug nor merder fun Rav lochem. Seemingly, when you say the words Rav lochem, it doesn't just mean that it's dai lochem, it has been enough, but it's Rav lochem, it's been a lot. Es is zu viel fareich, mer wie genug. Rav lochem seems to imply that it's been more than enough. It's too much. The Rashi is mefarish in pasuk, as Rashi actually says on the pasuk, vayemru aleim. The people of Korach said, Rav lochem, von Titus Korach v'adoset to Moshe v'Aaron. Korach's claim, Korach and his people claim to Moshe, Rav lochem, says Rashi, harbe yoiser midai lekachtem la'atzmechem gedula. You took more than enough greatness for yourself. He doesn't say you took enough, don't take any more. You took more than enough. So Rav lochem, the implication of the words Rav lochem is that it has been more than enough. You've been at this mountain more than enough. Und das ist bei Rashi schwer. This is before Rashi even begins. This is the answer to the question, what is even bothering Rashi? Why does Rashi say anything? What's wrong with the words Rav lochem sheves ba'arazeh? So the Rebbe begins by explaining what is bothering Rashi. What's bothering Rashi is like this. Harbe yoser midai, that oirech hazman von yeshivaschem ba'arazeh. To say that it's been too much, the time that you've been staying at this mountain, when Yidden are actually receiving more and more of Torah mitzvahs. So being there at the mountain was necessary, and it had great benefit. It also reminded them at all times the event of receiving the Torah at Har Sinai and everything that went along with it, which would have been extremely inspirational and motivational. That the mountain became called the mountain of Hashem, which means that it was a very holy spiritual place. So you can't say that it was too much. Every moment that they were there, they were learning more Torah mitzvahs. They were in a holy environment. They were in a beautiful place. Why is it too much? So if Hashem says it's time to go, you could say, okay, you had enough. How could you say that being at Har Sinai is more than enough if every single moment was valuable? That's what's bothering Rashi. And therefore Rashi brings Rav lochem sheves, and Rashi answers kipshutei. That's his first answer. Therefore Rashi clarifies. As afal pikein is the pirush harishon va'ikri von Rav lochem kipshutei. That despite this question, how can you say Rav lochem on being at Har Sinai? Rashi says no. The pashto pshat is taka kipshutei. Vayo leitem teichen von hemshach inyan doyin pasuk. What if you look back at the general context of what's being discussed in this pasuk is given Rav harbe yoser midai lochem sheves bahar. You will see that it actually has been too much, more than enough rather, to be at this mountain. In other words, as we'll see in a moment, even though every moment of being there was valuable and beneficial, nevertheless it comes to a point that the Eibishter says it's more than enough. As we're going to explain in Seif Hey. So the number one, what's bothering Rashi is the term Rav Lachem, which usually means it's more than enough. How can you say that it's more than enough being by Har Sinai? The answer to the question is that Rashi answers that it means Kipshutai, it was more than enough. And in Sifei, we're going to explain what that means. So first, we have to just introduce a general point. Was der ganze Inyan von the ersten drei Psukim, was Moshe Adag gesagt zu Eden. The first three psukim here, meaning not the first three psukim of Bamidbar. I think it's pasuk Vav Zayin and Ches in Bamidbar, where Moshe begins to start the story that he's telling the Yidden about their time together. And the first is saying, as this is given a dibur meyuchad from the Mebishtin, that there was a specific command from Hashem. Hashem Elokeinu dibur, that Hashem spoke to us and said, "You've been here enough." Pnu usu'u. The next pasuk says, begin the journey and go through, and the pasuk lists a bunch of stops that they have to go to get El Anor HaGodol Nahar Paros, to the great river, the Euphrates River, which was on the border of Eretz Yisrael. And then in the next pasuk, Rei nosati goimer lazaram acharem, see that I have given Eretz Yisrael to the Avos, Avram, Yisrael, Yaakov, and to their children. So Hashem is commanding Moshe, commanding the Yidden, to leave Har Sinai and to start traveling, to go to the land which Hashem had promised to the Avos and their children. So the question that we're pointing out, or the diuk is, Verit in ganzen nit der Mont Nechumas Bamidbar. It's not mentioned at all in Bamidbar. Der Iker Ortvus Netzich in the Sea from Midbar Sinai, which is the primary place where this journey is even discussed. Now keep in mind, Mishnah Torah is a repetition of all the experiences that the Yidden had with Moshe Rabbeinu. So usually, if something happened and it's told about in Devarim, especially if it's a story, not a halacha, then we would find the first time when it actually happened somewhere in the previous Chumashim. But in Bamidbar, Chumash Bamidbar, Parshat Ba'aloischa, where it talks about this journey, we don't see that there was a specific dibur. Der pasuk sagt dort nor. The only thing we do see over there, it was the second year, the 20th day of the second month. Now the honor, the cloud of glory lifted off of the Mishkan. And the Yidden journeyed from Midbar Sinai to their journeys. The time of the fun is move on. But we can answer the question. Why it doesn't say it here, why it doesn't say it there, but it says it over here. Duh! Over there it wasn't necessary. So therefore, it wasn't said over there. Why is Moshe mentioning it here if it wasn't necessary over there? Dort Moshe Rabbeinu gewollt mit Tare sein, far die Yidden, the Mahalecha in Yonim. Here Moshe is describing to the Yidden the order of the events. Beginning with where they were, their state at the time of Matan Torah, until the situation that they are in at this moment on the other side of the Yarden, ready to go into Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe was trying to emphasize that in truth the Yidden should have gone into Eretz Yisrael immediately after leaving Har Sinai. Und nur zu lieb dem Chet HaMeraglim, haben sie sich verhalten in Midbar dem ganzen Meshech Zman. It was only because of a chet, a sin, that was done by the Meraglim and the people of that time, that they were delayed in the Midbar all of this time. Der Iber muss man erzählen, als schön dann, wenn Iden seine noch gewähnt Becheire beim Har Sinai, hat sie der Eibishter angesagt, als sie sollen gehen gleich in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, these psukim are very necessary to understand what happened here, to understand that as far as the Eibishter was concerned, the journey was supposed to go straight from Har Sinai, straight to Eretz Yisrael, and not be in the Midbar for another 39 years. So Moshe clarifies to them, Hashem Elokeinu diber, Hashem spoke to us, it's time to leave Har Sinai, it's time to start traveling and to go to Eretz Yisrael. So here, in order to understand the story, that if not for the Meraglim, the Yidden were headed straight to Eretz Yisrael, it's necessary for Moshe here to tell us the psukim, Hashem Elokeinu diber. That's why these psukim are here, even though they're not in Parshas Bamidbar. So that's this deal that we have to understand. Why does Moshe Rabbeinu say something here that's not mentioned previously? The answer is because to understand the story, you have to understand that the plan was to go straight from Har Sinai, straight to Eretz Yisrael. The Alpize is move on, and according to this, we can understand what's the pasuk zog that why the pasuk says it Rav. And as we explained in Siv Dalid, Rav doesn't just mean you've been here for enough time; it means it's been more than enough. But now it makes sense. In order to emphasize how intense was the desire of Hashem zu eilen die Yidden in sollen bald reingehen in Eretz Yisrael, to hasten the Yidden, to rush them into immediately going to Eretz Yisrael. Ubeloshen Rashi, as Rashi says, so much was the Shechina working hard for you, to hasten your entry into Eretz Yisrael. So the Eibishter wanted it so much, so that so much so that despite the incredible achievements that their being at Har Sinai brought about, every moment of delay, because of that not going to Eretz Yisrael, it becomes more than enough. It's too much. It's too much because you're supposed to be going to Eretz Yisrael. So it doesn't negate the value of being there. But nevertheless, being there is holding them back from going to Eretz Yisrael, and the ultimate goal is to get there. And what the Eibishter wanted was to get them there very quickly. And therefore Hashem says, Rav Lachem, Sheves, it's been too much or more than enough, meaning to say that despite the value of being there, but it's holding you back from going to Eretz Yisrael. So that's the Kipshuta. That's the first part of Rashi. The first part of Rashi is that Kipshuta, that Rav Lachem means Kipshuta, Dai Lachem, and not just Dai Lachem, but Harbe Yoser Midai. It's been more than enough. Why? It was a valuable place to be, true, but nevertheless, it was holding you back from Eretz Yisrael, and the Eibishter wanted them to go very quickly to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he says, Rav Lachem, it's more than enough, it's time to head to Eretz Yisrael. That's the first part of Rashi. In Sivav, we're going to answer the question, why does Rashi need a second Pirush? Why do we not need? Why is the first Pirush not sufficient? Seemingly makes a lot of sense. Hashem wanted the Yidden to go to Eretz Yisrael. As you see that Moshe is talking about Hashem related to Penu Su'u, you see that this whole thing is about going to Eretz Yisrael. So clearly Hashem is saying, Rav Lachem. The Pirush is Nidglatik. This Pirush is not entirely smooth. Val from Lashon Rav Lachem Sheves Yoser Midai is mashma, as the Yeshiva Ba'aretz did Kiviyah Ratzon. In addition to Rav Lachem, meaning that it's been more than enough, it also implies, and you say you've been here more than you should be. It implies that they did something against the will of Hashem. That's the implication when you say that. Harbe Yoser Midai. It's been more than enough. You should have left earlier, is what you're basically saying. So the question is, how could you say that? Their delay at the mountain, the fact that they stayed at the mountain and didn't leave, is like in all the other encampments that they did, according to the commandment of Hashem. As long as the cloud didn't lift off the Mishkan, which means that Hashem had not commanded them to leave. Is there Sheves bar given al pi Hashem? Their being at the mountain was a fulfillment of the Eibishter's will. Is Vizak ben Yoser Midai? How could you say it's more than enough, implying that they did something wrong? They were following orders. They were there because Hashem never told them to leave. So therefore, even though we understand why one would say Harbe Yoser Midai, meaning to say because Hashem wanted them to go to Eretz Yisrael, but still the expression doesn't fit with the story. The story is they were waiting for Hashem to tell them to go. So why would you say Harbe Yoser Midai if they're waiting for Hashem to tell them to go? Therefore, Rashi has faith in Pirush from Medrash Haggadah, and therefore Rashi brings a second Pirush. As Rav Lachem nit kipshutim mervi genug. The Rav Lachem does not mean it's been more than enough. Nor harbe nor hirbo lachem gdulo schar. Rav Lashon Riboy, that Rav Lachem means Hashem multiplied. Hashem gave you a great quantity of greatness and reward. Meaning to say, Rav means not enough, but Rav means a lot. Lashon Riboy, that says fil gdulo schar, a great quantity of gedula and schar. Now, I think this next paragraph is a very, very fundamental, important paragraph to understand the rest of the Sikha. In Seif Hey, the Rebbe explained to us that the reason that the psukim these psukim are here, Pnuus Ulachem, Reina Sati, the Goimar is here, is because the Eibishter Moshe is emphasizing to the Yidden how the Eibishter wanted them to go straight from Har Sinai to Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe is going to say now that even according to the second Pirush of Rashi, that remains true. That there still is a connection between being at Har Sinai and going to Eretz Yisrael, which is why these psukim are even here. And once we understand that this connection exists, This will answer all of the questions that the Rebbe had on the second Pirush of Rashi, why Rashi doesn't follow the Lashon HaSifri, and all of the other details, as we will see in the Sikha. Kedei zu masbir sein as eich le dem Pirush is der Mechuven von dem Sagen zu Iden. Rav lochem sheves b'haraza, in order to explain that also according to this second explanation of Rashi, the purpose of saying to the Yidden Rav lochem sheves, however you're going to translate what it means, but the purpose of it is Tzutzu island and Pnu usulachem, to hasten the journey lemahir biyaskem la'aretz, to rush to bring more quickly, more swiftly, their arrival to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Was der far werd wegen der Amiris HaKadosh Baruch Hu d'tzelt Parshas Dafka Kanal, which is why this is brought up in this parsha, as we explained previously in Seif Hey. So the same reasoning that these psukim are here in order to tell us that the Eibishter wanted to rush and hasten the arrival of Yidden to Eretz Yisrael. It will work according to this pirush as well. Is Rashi nit maitik dem Lashon HaSifri? Rashi does not quote the words of the Sifri, nor the Medrash Agada. And the Rebbe is saying over here that Medrash Agada doesn't mean there is a Medrash that tells us a story. The Medrash Agada is the name of a Medrash. Vu der Lashon is, so the Rashi source is not the Sifri, as is referenced in many Chumashim, where it says at the end of Rashi in parentheses Sifri. Rashi's source is the Medrash Agada. Wo der Lashon is Asisem, Mishkan, Menoira, Vekelim, Kibaltem, Teurim, Minisem, Lacham Sanhedrim, where the Lashon in the Medrash Agada, not like the Sifri is, that you made a Mishkan, the Menoira, the Kelim, you received the Torah, you appointed a Sanhedrin, for them Dafkat Dizachem, because it is these items, und in dem Seder, and in this specific order, beweisen die Greatkeit von Yidden, display the readiness of the Yidden, to gain Eretz Yisrael, to fulfill the will of Hashem, and to go into Eretz Yisrael, Kidel Kamon, as will be explained in the next few seifim. So just so we understand, what was bothering Rashi about this first pirush was the fact that Rav Lachem seems to imply that it was against the will of Hashem, when in truth it was the will of Hashem, and therefore he has to change the meaning of Rav Lachem to not it's been enough, or more than enough, but that it means that you gained a great deal. And to explain what that means, Rashi is going to bring a Medrash Agada, and specifically these words of the Medrash Agada. And the order of the Medrash Agada is going to explain to us and show to us the readiness of the Yidden to fulfill the will of Hashem and to go to Eretz Yisrael. And the Rebbe begins to explain this in Seif Zayin. Eider Yidden seid in ein eigenes Land, in an Eretz Neshaves, before the Yidden will go into their own land, into a settled land, a place where they could live in a settled way, not like in a midbar. Was to say that Achaim and Eretz Neshaves K'chol Amim can Chas v'Shalom, their fearing went up the way of life in a regular settled land, a land that is like all the other nations. Can Chas v'Shalom, their fearing, it could gas shall lead to, as Eden sollen vergessen auf their Anderskeiten andere Völker, that the Yidden will forget their uniqueness from the other nations. So therefore, before they can actually go about and do this, haben sie früher gedacht verfestigen in sich, then the Atem to you, Limam Lachas Kern and the Gekadish, first they had to fortify within themselves the fact that they are a kingdom of Kayanim and the holy nation. It should be nikba. It should be ingrained in them, made permanent. In Azaifen, as gefindet sich später in Eretz Neshavis, in such a manner that even when later on they find themselves in a settled land, they should be a holy nation. They should be something that's more precious than all the other nations. Und der Fahrt is given the Yeshiva Bar Sinai, and this was the purpose of their dwelling at Har Sinai. Das hat aufgetan, as Eden sollen werden Agei Kodesh, it accomplished that Yidden should be a holy nation, bishleimus completely. Was in them seine Veran bechlalos drei inyanim, which this consists of three general elements or three steps. So the Rebbe is going to explain that there are three steps that bring the Yidden to becoming a Goy Kodesh, a holy people, and with that being ready and prepared to enter into Eretz Yisrael with everything that it entails. The Nekudik von Agay Kodesh is Balashna Kasav Kadeshim Tiyu Ki Kodeshani. The primary element of being a holy nation is you shall be holy because I, Hashem, is holy. When Muzayin Agay Kodesh Val Kodesh Ani is V'Shechanti B'Seichem. Sorry, we have to be holy because Hashem is holy. So how do you do this? Is v'shachanti b'seichem asisa mishkan. It's through Hashem dwelling in our midst. So the first step is to make a mishkan. In order to create a holy nation, the first step is to make a permanent space where the Eibishter's holiness can dwell. And this is why in Rashi, Mishkan comes first. As is nit genug der Gilei Elokus was given by Matan Torah. The revelation of godliness that existed that took place at Matan Torah doesn't suffice. The fact that Hashem spoke from the fire, but that was a temporary event. And not something where the Eibishter dwells amongst Yidden permanently. This answers the question why Rashi doesn't mention the Davar HaGadol, which we asked in the beginning of the Sikha, the fact that Hashem spoke from the fire through the fire, because Rashi is giving us examples and the recipe to creating a holy nation. So you need things that are going to impact the Yidden on a permanent level. The first thing is to bring the Eibishter into our midst. How do we do that? Through building a building, through making a Mishkan. Now we're going to answer why Rashi mentions Menorah. We asked one of our questions. Why does Rashi mention Menorah specifically? Since there is an emphasis. That will have an impact on the Yidden, even as they are living in a settled land. The Rebbe tells Rashi use Menorah von al Klei Mishkan. Therefore, Rashi identifies specifically the Menorah of all the other kelim. But Menorah, Rashi mefarish given as he is eidus l'chol boy elam shashchina sheida b'Yisrael, that the Menorah is a testimony to the entire world that the Shechina rests in Yidden. So, because the whole point over here is that there should be Hashras HaShechina, there should be the dwelling of the Shechina amongst Yidden in a permanent way. Rashi mentions the Menorah, which proves that point. The second step after building a Mishkan, it is a second step in creating a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation, is to receive the Torah. As Yusketelt kat from Goy Kadosh durch der Asheras HaShechina in Mishkan, to show that this uniqueness of this holy nation, because of the dwelling of the Shechina in the Mishkan, it has an influence, an impact. It changes and actually elevates the conduct of the Yid at any place and in his daily life. By receiving the Torah and the instructions from Hashem. So first you have a Hashras HaShechina, but now the Hashras HaShechina could be there, but it doesn't necessarily affect the person's daily life. So the next step is to receive the Torah, so that way the person can inculcate the teachings of Torah, the holiness of Torah into their life. For the Yidden to know and to understand properly what are the Torah's instructions. You have to have this third step of appointing a Sanhedrin, which they teach to the Yidden the various subjects and dinim of Torah. And they show to the Yidden, instruct the Yidden how to fulfill the instructions of Torah, and therefore you're able to know what to do with Torah. So the three steps that Rashi mentions, Mishkan, Torah, and Sanhedrin, are in the order of how you would make a Goy Kadosh ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael. And that's why the Yidden were at Har Sinai. That is the Gedula that the Yidden receive at Har Sinai, the fact that they were elevated and prepared to go into Eretz Yisrael as a Goy Kadosh. Now the Rebbe is going to answer why Rashi, when he brings the Sanhedrin, does not mention Sarei Chamishim and Sarei Asarais, the officers over the groups of 50 and the officers over the groups of 10. And according to this, we'll understand why Rashi only brings the officers over groups of 1,000 and the officers over groups of 100, and not as the Sifri does, which brings also the officers over the 50s and the officers over the 10s. The fact that there were appointments over groups of 50 and over groups of 10. It was only for the time period when the Yidden were in the Midbar. in Masoyis because they were in route, they were journeying, and there are the pressures of the travel. You need to have people in charge of smaller groups. Once the Yidden enter into Eretz Yisrael, in a settled land, in a permanent space, you don't need a person in charge over every 50 people, and certainly not over every 10 people. When we bowed as Rashi Rechen nor the Yonim Chazan Murchut to the great Kat Lebanon Eretz Yisrael via Gei Kodesh, and since Rashi is only giving us examples of things that are necessary to get ready to live in Eretz Yisrael as a holy people, the mountain of Sari Alaf and Sari Meis, because in Eretz Yisrael you're not going to need Sari Chamishim and Sari Asari, so therefore Rashi has no need to mention it, because going into Eretz Yisrael they're going to have the Shechina with them, they're going to be learning Torah, they're going to have a Sanhedrin to teach them how to understand and implement the rules of Torah, but there's no need for Sari Chamishim and Sari Asaris for groups of 50 and groups of 10. And therefore, Rashi doesn't mention it. Oh. So we still have to go back to the first part of Rashi, where we ask three questions. Why Rashi says Gedula and Schar. Why Rashi says Al Yeshivaschem, that the Schar was for being in Eretz Yisrael, for being at the mountain, not that being at the mountain was the Schar. And why Rashi says Minisem Lochem, you appointed for yourselves, when the Sifri says Minisi Aleichem, I Hashem appointed. According to this, we'll also understand the different other changes in Pirush the Gabi Lashon Sifri Del Sif Gimel between Rashi and the Sifri that were mentioned earlier in Sif Gimel. Late Rashi is Kavanas Apostle Rav Lachem v'Geimar zu Miram Zayin nicht stam in Yonis Schar was Eden of Bakum Baharazeh. So according to Rashi, when the pasuk says Rav Lachem, it doesn't mean to tell us the reward that just the reward that the Yidden received at the mountain, nor does was the Yeshiva Baharat Ufketon. He wants to talk about the accomplishment, what was achieved by Yidden being at the mountain. As Yidden's own Vermuchan to the Knis Laretz. Yidden should become prepared to entering into the Eretz Yisrael. Und der Farbe genügend sich nicht Rashi mit dem Loschen Schar. Therefore Rashi doesn't suffice with the word Schar. Und sagt euch hier Balachem Gdula, and says also he increased your greatness. Weil der Ikir ist dort die Gedule, zu welche Yidden dann zugekommen durch Yishvas und Bahar. The most important point Rashi is making is that the Yidden had a greatness that they achieved by being at the mountain. It wasn't just a reward, but actually they themselves changed. They became different people in preparation to going into Eretz Yisrael. They became greater. And therefore Rashi has to say the word Gedula to emphasize this word that we've been saying throughout the Sikha, that the being at the mountain actually prepared the Yidden in these three steps to go into Eretz Yisrael. When we bow as the Gedula is not the Yeshiva Bahar Gufa, nor das was is gekommen auf Tetzah von der Yeshiva Bahar. And this answers our second question of Sif Gimel. Since the greatness wasn't being there, it was what came as a result of being there. The fact that they became holy. The Rebbe sagt Rashi, nicht scharu lechem yisvaschem ba'arazeh. Therefore, Rashi does not say it was a reward for you to be there. No, schar al yisvaschem. It was a greatness and a reward for being there, because it was the result that came out of being there that brought them to this gedula and this schar. Now, in the next paragraph, the Rebbe explains that really there's two elements that happen here. And even though it doesn't say clearly in the Sikha, l'cha'ira, what the Rebbe is explaining, why Rashi says schar and, it does say clearly, almost says it clearly, why Rashi says schar and gedula. Could have just said gedula. Here, b'lechem gedula. If the main thing is that they were changed and became a good kaddish, he could have said gedula, but Rashi says schar or gedula. So the Rebbe now explains that really there's two elements here, two details. He says it very clearly. The two Lashonis that Rashi says Gedula and Schar actually are referring to two aspects within going into Eretz Yisrael that is written here in the Psukim. Aleph, that Etzem and Ein kommen in Eretz Yisrael. First, the very idea that they were going into Eretz Yisrael. For this, it is required that Yidden should have greatness. They have to be a kingdom of Kohanim, a holy nation, Canal, and therefore they had to go through these things of Mishkan and Torah and Sanhedrin in order to bring them to a point that they would be in a place of Gedula to go into Eretz Yisrael. There's another aspect. How, the manner of going into Eretz Yisrael. So the pasuk says, Boyu Urushu. Go and inherit. Rashi on that pasuk says, Ein ma'arer bedavar. You're going to go in without anybody objecting, and you don't need milchama, you're not going to need war. Rashi continues, if not for the Chet HaMeraglim, lo yayu tzrichim l'klei zayin, if not for the Meraglim, they would not have needed any weaponry. They would have been able to go in without a war, without a fight. So at this point, when Hashem is speaking to the Yidden, when they're still at Har Sinai, Hashem is telling them, not only are you going to Eretz Yisrael, but you're going to Eretz Yisrael and you're going to conquer it without a war. So das is a schar, was it in the Bekumin, for them was eben getom bis man yishvelsam bahar. That the fact that they can go in without a war, without weaponry, that's a reward for what they've accomplished by being at the mountain. So two things happened: schar and gedula. First, they changed. They became great people, a goy kodesh, ready to go into Eretz Yisrael, and that they can go into Eretz Yisrael. But in addition to that, they were given a reward that they would go in without a fight, they would go in without weaponry. Now, in the end, there was the Chet Meraglim and things changed, but at this point, there is a schar that they get for being there, and that schar is that they would go in without a fight. In Sif Tes, we're going to explain the last question of Minisi and Minisem. So the truth, also by the appointment of the Sanhedrin, there were two elements. One, durch dem Eberstein, they were appointed by the Eberster, as it says in Yisrael, v'tzivcha Elokim, that Yisrael told Moshe, Hashem should command it. And then two, durch vayivchar Moshe, unhavu lochem. And at the end, Moshe was the one who actually makes the choice, and the Yidden present people to Moshe. So Hashem chose, and the Yidden chose. So in a sense, this is similar to these two things of Gedula and Schar. Gedula is something that the Yidden do. Schar is something that the Eibishter does. So when we're talking about the appointment of the Sanhedrin, there is the Eibishter choosing them, which is similar to the concept of Schar. There is the Yidden choosing them, which is the Alderech, the Inyan of Gedula. So in Sifri, wo man brengt daraus Inyan Schar, gegeben von dem Eibishter, in the Sifri, where the focus is on the reward, he only uses the word Schar, doesn't mention the word Gedula. Is there Madgis Minisi Aleichem? So he also says that Hashem chose the Sanhedrin. In other words, Hashem is giving a reward and he's doing something for the Yidden. He's choosing the Sanhedrin. However, Barashi, Barashi was emphasizing more the greatness of the Yidden, the things the Yidden did for themselves. Rashi says that the Yidden chose the Sanhedrin. This is part of the Gedula that they achieved, that they were doing all the right things, preparing themselves for going to Eretz Yisrael. So now, if we were to go through all of the questions, I actually have it written down, and we'll go through it very quickly. What's bothering Rashi? The fact that it says that Rav Locha means more than enough, and seemingly everything that all the time that they were there was necessary. Rashi answers that it means kipshutai, because it was more than enough, because it was withholding them from going to Eretz Yisrael. What's bothering Rashi about the first pshat, that it seems like it was going against their will, they're going against Hashem's will, and seemingly they were just following Hashem's order, and therefore Rashi changes that Rav Lachem doesn't mean enough, Rav Lachem means a lot. Why does Rashi say the word schar? Why did I say the word gedula? Because there were two things happening here. There was schar and gedula. There was a reward that they were getting, but there was also a greatness that they were achieving as a preparation to go into Eretz Yisrael. Why does Rashi say it in the wrong order? Not in the wrong chronological order, because since the point of here is to create a Goy Kodesh, a holy nation that's able to handle life in Eretz Yisrael as an Eretz Nesheves, you have to start with a Ashras Ashchina, which is Mishkan. Then you have to bring it into your own life, which is a Kabbalah Satayra, and then you have to have people to teach it to you to know what to do. And why does he mention Menorah? Because since the whole point is that the Shechina is amongst the Yidden, so he mentions the Menorah, which is a testimony to the Shechina being amongst Yidden. And why doesn't he mention the Davar HaGadol of Hashem speaking through the fire? Because that was temporary, that didn't affect the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael. And why does he bring Kabbalah Satayra if that wasn't something new that happened in Matan Torah? He's not focusing on something new that happened in Matan Torah. He's focusing on what the Yidden have to do to get ready to go into Eretz Yisrael. And why does he say Minisi Aleichem? Because Rashi is talking about Gedula, the Avodah of the Yidden, and therefore he talks about the Yidden choosing Sanhedrin. And why does he not say Sari Allah? Why does he say Sari Allah from Sari Meis and not Sari Chamishim and Sari Asaris? Because in Eretz Yisrael there was no such thing, and therefore, since this whole discussion is about going into Eretz Yisrael, those jobs are irrelevant. The Yenish Al Torah. Rashi is my take from pasuk no diverte Rav lachem sheves on diverte b'haraza. Rashi quotes from the pasuk the words Rav lachem sheves. You've been here enough. However you teach it, without saying the words b'haraza. When teach kipshute, and he says it means literally. When in the medrash agad diverte b'haraza, it's only when he brings the medrash does he say the words b'haraza. So that by not saying b'haraza implies that Rav lachem sheves is true wherever you are, not just by the Har Sinai. Wherever a person goes, the message of Rav lachem sheves is applicable. And the Rashi is alluding to us, is signaling to us a very general and important lesson in serving Hashem. Ayid has to know, as a matzif von sheves, bleiben sitzen auf ein Ort, sitting, remaining status quo in one place, stehen auf der selber Darge bei Vedos Yisborach und nicht gehen weiter, to be at the same space, the same plateau in serving Hashem, and not to go higher and further, is Rav lochem kipshutei harbe yisrael. It's too much. If you're in a certain place, in a certain plateau in serving Hashem, and you're not advancing, then you've been there for too long. As great, as high, as lofty as your plateau may be, is aber ein Hemshechsman von bleiben sitzen auf derselben Darge, but a significant amount of time of remaining in the same place, in the same plateau, is abgegeben auf dem zu viel Zeit, means you've dedicated too much time to that level. Ayid of seinem Mahalach, Ayid has to be a goer. Kiseder streben zu und gehen als Hecher, constantly strive to and to go ever higher. Mailin b'kodesh, always to increase in holiness. That's the lesson lesson number one at least, that we take from this pasuk and the way Rashi teaches it. Rav lochem sheves kipshutei, that if you're in one place for too long, it's more than enough. You got to keep on going. Yudalef noch higher off, as McKenna understands from the Pirush Rashi. There's another lesson that comes from this Rashi. The Gerat Kama problem, it's been discussed many times, and something that the Rebbe brings many siches. Haben alle Perushim of the Zelben Pasuk Hashayach Zelazah. All the different commentaries, all the different explanations of the same pasuk actually connect one to another. Especially here, that Rashi brings both in the same pirush under the same heading. Clearly, there is a connection between the two of them. And this is the lesson that we take from the two of them together. These 2 points that are being made with regards to going into Eretz Yisrael. The first meaning, when Rashi said Rav lachem sheves has been too much, because you have to go as fast as possible to Eretz Yisrael. That's one point. That you have to go as swift as possible, conquer the land. Beis the pirush as the smeiti achana ruchnis to the Knesset Laaretz. Then there's a second pirush in Rashi referring to the spiritual preparation to entering into the land. As he said, Mishkan kibaltum teirim nislacham sanhedrin zanitali zebazeh. These two pirushim, number one, that we got to get there as soon as possible, and number two, that we have to prepare ourselves spiritually for it, are actually interconnected. Because we're a holy people, we have this greatness and this reward. That is why we're receiving Eretz Yisrael. Because we're spiritually prepared, that's why we rush into Eretz Yisrael. Which is the opposite of how it works in other nations. In most other nations, what makes a nation a nation? They have a land. Even think about the names you call people: the Russians, the Germans, the Polish. They're named after their land. First, you have a land, and then on that land you establish a peoplehood. By Yidden is the inyan for Rav lachem sheves kipshutei. Then the Meir biaschem loretz, but by Yidden it doesn't work like that. By Yidden, they're first, they're becoming holy, they're becoming a goy kadosh, and then they get the land. So when it says Rav lachem, that it means they have to rush to enter into Eretz Yisrael, is nit nur amihirus bisman. Doesn't just mean in physical time they have to rush into it. They're eichel beikir amihirus from biaschem. Also, the way it's done has to be done in a swift way. Because if you go according to the second pirush, that you've reached a great level, you've prepared yourself spiritually. In that case, there will be no objectors. You'll go in without a war. You'll go in without weaponry. In Ander Verter, I'm going to explain, but I'm just going to read the next paragraph so you can understand exactly what the Rebbe is saying. The Sheiches von Eretz Yisrael to Eden is in ganzen anders wie andere Völker. The relationship of Eretz Yisrael with Eden is very different than it is in other nations. In other nations, the land does not have an intrinsic, internal connection between the people and the land. Therefore, they have to go to war for it. because the only way they can take ownership of it is through war. Mashenkin by Eden is their verbund mit Eretz Yisrael in an Eifen. But by Yidden, their bond, their connection with Eretz Yisrael is in such a way, be'ez Eden sein in a matzah von Gei Kodesh. Begolui is a snicker begolui, and when the Yidden, be'ez Eden sein in a matzah von Gei Kodesh begolui, is a snicker begolui, and when Yidden are a holy nation in a revealed way, then we see this bond in a revealed way. And does land belong to Yisrael? The land belongs intrinsically, inherently belongs to the Yidden, and therefore it's not about the war. It's just about their spiritual preparation for it, and then they could enter into the land without a war, without weaponry. So the second lesson that we're taking from this Rashi is that if we want to go into Eretz Yisrael and we want to hasten our entry into Eretz Yisrael and to go without war and without weaponry, we have to spiritually prepare ourselves. We have to do everything in our power to lift ourselves up, to have the gedula, the greatness, to be able to connect spiritually with Eretz Yisrael, and then when we do that, we can enter into Eretz Yisrael because it's our land and without war. As the Tanchuma says, over there that the Eibishter divided all of the lands of the world, all the countries in the world, to all of the malachim, the different angels of the nations. Ubachar lechelkei Yisrael. Bachar Eretz Yisrael, and of all the lands, Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael. And then he divided all of the nations. Ubachar lechelka Yisrael. And then Hashem chose for his own portion, he chose the Yidden. And then Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then Hashem says, in each case, the Chulu is the Tanchuma brings a pasuk. The pasuk that Hashem chose the land of Eretz Yisrael is B'hanchel Elyon Goyim, and the lashon that Hashem chose the Yidden is Kichelek Hashem Amoy. And then the Tanchuma says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yoveyu Yisrael, Shebo Lechelkei, may the Yidden come who have been chosen to be the Eibishter's portion, V'yinchalu es haaretz shebo Lechelkei, and they will inherit the land that became the Eibishter's portion. In other words, the relationship between Yidden and Eretz Yisrael is because Hashem chose them. Hashem chose Eretz Yisrael, Hashem chose Yidden, and Hashem chose that they should be connected. So as long as we can be on the level of Goy Kodesh and prepare ourselves properly, then we are able to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Und durch a bris, was can came zu statt werden. And this bond was in a bris, in a covenant. As we learned last week in the Sicha of Parshas Matis, in Chelek Chav Gimel. Is ein therefore there's no objectors and there's no need for war, because once we lift ourselves up to this level of Goy Kodesh, then there's no need for anything. If there's a bris, and even without the Goy Kodesh, there's still an intrinsic connection. Just it has to come begolui. And so may we see it speedily nowadays for us. That we will merit to receive the entire, complete Eretz Yisrael in a manner of where there are no objectors and there's no need for war. Speedily nowadays.